Welcome to Intersections, a podcast of Seton Hall's Institute for Communication in Religion and Interreligious Studies, media, spotlighting conversations with authors featured in the Journal of Interreligious Studies, along with scholars, educators, and community organizers in the field. My name is Axel Takach. I'm an assistant professor here at Seton Hall University and editor-at-large of Interreligious Studies Media. And today our guest is Joanna Homrighausen, lecturer for Judaic Studies and Religious Studies at the College of William and Mary. She's written extensively on religion and the arts, especially contemporary calligraphy and lettering arts, such as in her two books, Planting Letters and Weaving Lines, Calligraphy, The Song of Songs, and the St. John's Bible, out in 2022 with Liturgical Press, and Illuminating Justice, the Ethical Imagination of the St. John's Bible, 2018 Liturgical Press as well. Today, Joanna is with us to discuss her article, Liturgical Letters, Jewish and Christian Calligraphic Art and Comparative Theology, which appeared in issue 41 of the Journal of Interreligious Studies. So, Joanna, thank you for joining me today.
Thank you for inviting me.
So we're going to get started. For listeners new to both, perhaps comparative theology, new to the lettering arts or calligraphy, how would you summarize in a few sentences your article or the central point or thesis of your article for us today before we get started?
So I describe myself as a scholar. I look at the visual and material elements, dimensions of sacred text. And this was one of the earlier articles I wrote in that vein. Actually, it was fun to revisit it because your students, I know you have students listening, they might identify with this. If you're an academic and you publish a paper, it's not unlike at the end of a term where you write it and then it's published and you sort of forget everything that you said. So it was fun to revisit. In this article, I looked at two pieces, one by a Jewish calligrapher, one by a calligrapher formed by Christianity, playing with Christian sacred text, and how they help us think about words and writing and what those things do, both for individuals in a sort of spiritual level and for a religious tradition, a sacred tradition on the whole, the process of writing, the visuality of writing. So this was really looking at two pieces, very concrete in particular, but kind of using those to open a broader conversation and reflection, which is a lot of what I do.
Great. And what about the aspect of comparative theology? So if you can sort of explain that, the discipline, and what you were trying to do with respect to visual arts to sort of fill a gap, perhaps, in comparative theology.
No, this was an interesting article for me. It's fun to kind of look back and see what you've done. This was a bit of an oddball because I'm not a comparative theologian. My PhD, I was trained in Hebrew Bible, and I am Jewish. I converted in the middle of my doctorate, which was funny because I went to Duke, which is known for turning out people who do Christian theological exegesis, among other things, and I became Jewish while I was there. So I wasn't really thinking about comparative theology more broadly. I wanted to write an article in honor of Lucinda Mosier, who'd been a very formative mentor for me. And this was the first article where I really wrote in a sort of Jewish theological way. I was trying to start playing with that voice, which is very different from the kind of history of Judaism approach to Jewish studies that I'd been trained in. It was a little more fun, a little more playful when I wrote about the Shaviti, because I was letting myself kind of do my own spin on it. So I'm not sure I'd call myself a comparative theologian, but it was a voice that I enjoyed exploring for this article, and I'm glad it's found resonance with some people.
Yes, certainly. I mean, so for comparative theology, as you write in the article, right, the focus is on sort of a slow, careful reading of texts, right? And often these texts
Yeah.
are already edited into bound critical editions, certainly in the primary source language, if one is trained well enough in it. But it's sitting with texts sort of in this modern format of a book. So what do you think? What is added to the and by the way, comparative theology is this practice of sort of one scholar of a particular religious tradition. Like in my case, I'm Catholic. I'm a Catholic comparative theologian, but I have experience and expertise in the classical and post-classical Islamic intellectual traditions and even modern Islamic thought as well, in which I read Islamic texts in order to offer insights and clarifications or even to challenge my own Catholic theological positions and write after the comparison. But it is very much a text-based project. At most, I work especially on poetry, so I do have to attend to the sonic structures of poems and meter and rhyme and how it sounds when it's recited. So I do a little bit of the aesthetic and theopoetic aspects of it, but I don't attend to sort of visual art. I'm curious then, what do you think that attending to calligraphy or visual art might add to this comparative theological exercise that has been so text-based for so long?
Well, I'd back up a bit and I'd argue that all of our interaction with text is mediated in some way or another, even if it's not marked as something we might call a fine art or something that a that is meant to look fancy and entice visually. So I, in my dissertation and my work, I do a lot of work with book history in the Bible, and I've strongly been influenced by people like James Watts and the scholars involved in the Society for Comparative Research on Iconic and Performative Texts, as well as people who work on material religion. I'm not the first to say this by any means, that all of our engagement with this thing called the Bible or any sacred text is mediated in some way. There's a scholar in this circle called Dorina Miller Parmenter, and she wrote this article that talked about the discourse of duct tape. That is, in certain churches, if your Bible's really beat up and it's just held together by duct tape on the binding, that itself is a visual statement. That's a sort of iconic power. It's a almost a way of signaling, I've read this thing so much, I've extracted so much of its spiritual value, and this is the husk that remains. So that's a sort of like a broader level. All of our reading of text is material in some way, even if it is a computer screen or through sound waves, through orality. So why in particular the medium of calligraphy, of something that is marked? In many religious traditions, the sacrality of a text's language is a strong factor, right? Since you work with Islam, right, you can't really look at Islamic art without looking at calligraphy, no matter what kind of language you're looking at and what region you're looking at. Like the presence of Islamic calligraphy of Quranic verses is always there. So I think that there's less of a clear and kind of standardized tradition with Christianity, which of course has a different relationship to the sacrality of its text's original language than, say, Muslims and Jews do. But there's certainly a tradition of Christian calligraphy. So I think it also helps us engage the body in a different way, because the act of actually copying a sacred text, there's a sort of meditation to it. And during COVID, there were groups of people, like this isn't just something for like trained scribes, right? There are people who copy the Bible by hand just as a private devotional exercise, and they're just kind of writing in notebooks with their handwriting. People do this. And during COVID, I think maybe there were more people doing it. You can go on YouTube and find videos of people copying the Bible by hand. So I think all of this kind of relates. It helps us flesh out a broader picture of how we engage sacred texts and how they live in our lives in a very day-to-day way, as opposed to a theological, or I don't even want to say theological, like sort of conceptual only way.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense. I'm curious then if there was a particular encounter that you had, maybe with a manuscript or a scroll or a calligraphic work of art or other work of art, that sort of led you to some of the writing you've done in this article regarding the St. John's Bible. Was there a certain experience that encouraged you to turn your attention to the letter arts in particular, or visual art as well?
This was a complete accident. I want to be very clear.
Yes.
I did not
Most things in
intend.
academia are a complete accident. I stumbled into a classroom 15, 20 years ago, and it took the direction of my my work. I was like, "Who are you?" And I didn't
Exactly.
realize that it was a particular professor who was going to change all my studies. But yeah.
Yes. So I remember I was 25, 24, somewhere in there. I was just a crazy kid, and I was starting my master's degree, and I worked in my university special collections department. I was just a student assistant, and we had one of the facsimiles of the St. John's Bible, the Heritage Edition. And if you're not familiar with the St. John's
Yeah, maybe
Bible,
give a
it is.
background to that if you don't mind. Yeah.
Yes. So the St. John's Bible, it was begun in the late 90s and finished in 2013. This was an illuminated manuscript that is a handmade Bible with paint and ink and gold on parchment, full medieval style, that was created jointly between the chief scribe, Donald Jackson, in the UK, and its patrons and theological guiders, who were mostly, it was the monks of St. John's
Hmm.
Abbey in College, Minnesota, the people who run St. John's University, associated with Liturgical Press. They wanted to do something to celebrate the millennium, so they made this giant Bible that is a monument of spirituality and art history and art and manuscript scribal technique and images that play with, that meditate on the text. So I really fell down this rabbit hole. I was asked if I could learn a little blurb. People come in. My boss said, "You're in graduate school for Bible stuff. You could talk about this," and it just sort of grabbed hold of me a little insanely. This is where the ADD comes in. You get the hyper focus. So that was what I really learned with. That was the first book, was mostly about the images, and the second book was really thinking about calligraphy and what is it doing, and how do we look at a page of calligraphy, because it's not an art form that we are trained in. You take an art history class in college, you take art appreciation, and they teach you how to look at a painting, how to look at a sculpture. They don't really teach you how to look at a page of beautiful hand lettering and what it communicates beyond just the words
Hmm.
as signifiers of meaning. So that was what really got me into this. And from the St. John's Bible, I started moving outwards. I I started looking. My first forays were looking at other people who were working with biblical text. I remember I set myself a challenge. I wanted to write about a work of contemporary calligraphy, which is what I do. A lot of it is I write about contemporary calligraphy, Hebrew and English. I wanted to write about something that was not just treating the Bible. I kind of push myself out of going from like Bible and art to religion and art. And this article was a kind of way that I met that challenge. And
Hmm.
so that was fun to write about. I should also say, I know you have students who are listening. This was the first article, the first thing that was published under my name, Joanna. Everything before that was some other guy, some other person named Jonathan, who's like, you know, jokingly, I like murdered him and took his life, and took it over. So I just want to say that because I know you have students who are listening, and sometimes it's important to know, oh, like we're out there.
Of course. Oh no, thank you for that. Of course. Um, so in this article, this is a good a follow up question because at the time, when you saw that manuscript in St. John's, um, you had not yet converted to Judaism, correct?
No,
Yeah.
no.
So
There's a lot of, I'm giving you a lot of directions to go in.
no, that's fine. That's fine. I mean, this is helpful. I mean, because you write in the article that you're Jewish, a convert. You say a non-acrimonious convert to Christianity, and that you still appreciate Christian art and liturgy. So I'm also curious then how this biographical journey, or even a spiritual autobiography, if you will, shapes some of your theological instincts in these projects of calligraphy across Christian and Jewish traditions.
I would say my own spiritual autobiography is probably more boring than you might think, but I my own conversion to Judaism was a bit of a surprise and something that I wasn't running from something. It just sort of fit in a deeper way. I had been an Episcopalian, so I don't know too many people who are formerly Episcopalian who were traumatized by it.
Yeah.
And yes, and also here's a fun fact: in my early 20s, I wanted to be a Jesuit. I did convert to Catholicism, so I had a bit of a wanderings, one might say, and I was doubly Jesuit educated. I
Mm-hmm.
went to Santa Clara University for
Okay.
my undergrad, and then I went to the Jesuit School of Theology in Berkeley for my master's degree. So you ask about all of this. Um, I think how did my conversion shape me?
Or at least in this
I
particular
think
project, or
in this particular project,
these projects that you work on in terms of liturgical letters and letter arts and calligraphy. Yeah,
I think the fact that I can speak Christian has been very
yeah,
helpful
interesting.
in my looking at a lot of Christian art. I can sort of understand concepts like sacramentality. I'm not thrown off by New Testament allusions or citations. So I think that's been very helpful to just kind of be able to think in multiple religious settings.
Mm-hmm. Great. Let's thank you for that. Let's you write sort of get into the weeds a little bit of your article here. I think
Yeah.
you wrote at one point that comparative theology often treats texts primarily as signifiers. Um, what do we miss then when we ignore often, and you alluded to this already a little bit, when you ignore the iconic or material and performative dimensions of texts? So this is where you see um, maybe it's less about the text itself, but how a reader approaches it. So as you treat a text only as mere signifier, maybe you can explain what you mean by that, and then what you mean by ignoring the iconic or material aspects.
So what do I mean by treating the text as a mere signifier? Think of a portrait, like you go to an art museum, and there will often be rooms that have a lot of portraits of.
Mm-hmm.
I jokingly call them the dead white men rooms. They're
Mm-hmm.
just 18th century European portraits of nobles,
Yeah.
and of course you could just look through the image and say this is a representation of so and so, or you can look at the image and see how is the painter mediated their view of who this person is,
Mm-hmm.
right? What a lot of what a painter does is sort of tell a story in a particular way. So I would argue a calligrapher does very much the same thing. If we look at a work of lettering art or calligraphy, and I would also include things like typography, things like graffiti. I'm very expansive. If we look at a work of visible language and we just see what does the language mean semantically, like when I say signifier, like the word boat refers to a boat or a concept of a boat, we're missing the actual letters on the page, the shapes, the colors, the way they're arranged, the feeling that that might convey. So looking at the letters instead of looking through the letters,
Mm-hmm.
treating them as their own things to be looked at, their own things to appreciate, rather than just pointers to something
Mm-hmm.
else. So when we ignore that, what are we missing? I think I'd say two things. We're missing the body. We're missing the way that we see, the way that we kind of sense letters and words on multiple levels, not just cognitively grasping what they mean. And I would argue we miss most of what goes on in religion, because most people, when they're engaging with sacred texts, they're not, most of the time, even the people who are the theologians or the biblical scholars or the sort of intellectual um, teachers of a tradition, even for them, and I'd argue definitely for everybody else, most of what we're doing when we read the Bible is very embodied. Like we know Psalms not because we generally sit in a seminar room and parse the Hebrew grammar and read a bunch of commentaries and dissect their ancient Near Eastern context. We know Psalms because we pray them. We pray them in liturgy, whether you're Jewish or Christian. We sing them, we know the tunes, we have them kind of live in our brains like that. So I think, to me, what people do with sacred text on that level is endlessly fascinating, endlessly interesting. And when we ignore that, we ignore a lot of what sacred texts actually do in a religion, as opposed to just what a certain small community of mostly male sort of intellectual authorities in a
Mm-hmm.
tradition are
Yeah.
doing with them.
No, even me, even myself, when I engage texts or in themselves, looking at them, studying them, translating them, um, I'm always reminding myself that no matter what, especially when I teach, right, I'm reminding students religions are only ever embodied and placed and enacted. They don't exist out there in the void, but they only exist because certain bodies are living them in certain places and enacting them in certain ways, right?
Yeah.
I think you're right. I think calligraphy is a good example of the visual arts of this. This is sort of the that you open your article with that distinction between aesthesis and noesis, right? The sensory perceptions versus the sort of intellectual engagement. I think that's related to this too, right?
Uh-huh.
Yeah. Let's go to one of the case studies. The first one, the was it? Let's see here. Let's see. Yeah, Izzy Pludwinski's Shivity columns. And so, they're in your
Yes.
article. The images that are in your article, we'll definitely repost them on the website or integrate them later. So people can look at them. But just to get us started, how would you describe the Shivity columns? And what is a Shivity column and what's on them and so forth?
So the Shiviti
Shiviti,
column is
thank you.
actually, that's okay. I think in Hebrew generally, especially if you're speaking it in sort of like the way biblical scholars are trained to pronounce it, that the accent goes towards the end of the word.
Yeah.
So anyway, the Shiviti columns are a play on a known genre of ritual art known as a Shiviti plaque, which would have this phrase, Shiviti Adonai, Lenegdi Tamid. I place the Lord before me at all times, which
Mm-hmm.
is a verse from Psalm 16.
Mm-hmm.
This was sort of literally, if you put this on a plaque in front of you, you're kind of materially instantiating what the psalm actually tells you to do. It's a kind of materialization of the metaphor. If we think metaphorically, God is before me at all times, that you could think of that in a spiritual way. And so here you put it on a plaque and it's literally right in front of you.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, so there's, these things work on multiple levels. So he did these as columns, and I haven't actually seen the columns, but I had a lot of photos of them to work from. And the columns are, they have this verse, but the letters are painted with a brush in a very East Asian style. They're very gestural. It's not highly legible unless you know what it's supposed to say.
Mm-hmm.
And also, instead of the usual Hebrew square script, like the block letters, one might say, that are usually printed, this is cursive. This is the kind of everyday writing that people do if they speak Hebrew. And he's using that as the basis for the calligraphy instead of the square script. So it communicates, it's a sort of beautiful lines that, if you don't know what they are, might look like certain kinds of Japanese calligraphy.
Great. No, thank you for that description. So yes, the psalm that's on there is, "I set the Lord before me always, because He is at my right hand. I shall not be moved." That's Psalm 16, verse 7. You know in your article, um, you connect it to halakhic and devotional traditions as well. Um, is there something different that's happening when the Shaviti is placed sort of on a three-dimensional column as opposed to just a plaque? Did you find something in that as well, or?
I think that there's a way of kind of walking around it,
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
and
Yeah.
uh, that might be a form of meditation. There's a whole world of calligraphic sculpture. Actually, that's the book I'm writing this summer about a guy who does letter carving in wood and
Mm-hmm.
plays with text. And of course, the wood, a lot of them are freestanding sculptures. So you have to kind of walk around them. They're big chunks of wood. A lot of them are driftwood. So Plodwinski's doing some of that. I also thought there was an interesting play between these columns and the idea in the Torah of God appears as the column of cloud,
Yeah.
the pillar of cloud, the pillar of fire. So there's a kind of play between the material form, or the shape of these
Mm-hmm.
objects, and these ancestral memories of Jewish tradition, of a time when God was literally going before the Israelites and guiding, and a time when they were very vulnerable and needed that guidance.
Mm-hmm.
So I think there's it kind of adds a lot of dimensions to the text that spark the imagination. I have no idea how many of these Plodwinski himself
Yeah.
was thinking.
The column is a good one. I mean, if the column of fire and is also described as the Shekinah, correct as well in the Bible, right? Is that
I don't
possible?
remember if that specific word is
Yeah,
used, but yeah, the Shekhinah is the kind of
the divine
the
presence, sort of.
presence of divine presence, which if you get into Kabbalah is a
Hmm.
much stronger image of God
Well, certainly,
dwell.
I mentioned that precisely because I set the Lord before me always. There's the presence of God um, in the plaque or in the column as well, or at least in referenced in the psalm. Um, so let's, if we want to get into some of the details of this calligraphy too, um, for instance, you read the swirling Hebrew letter. I think it's the he at the end of it, abbreviation
Yeah.
for the name of God, right? Not voicing the tetragrammaton, the holy name of God. He said it's almost kind of like a calligraphic apophasis, or echoing Zen Enzo. So maybe if you could maybe explain a little bit more about that, I'd be curious for
Yeah.
our listeners to sort of maybe get a primer on apophasis and Enzo as well. You know?
This was fun to write, and I'll say, like, I think as writers we all have certain rules that we make for ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
One of my rules: I do not write in a scholarly way about Arabic script calligraphy or East Asian calligraphy, not because I don't think they're amazing, but I just don't know enough, and other people do them a lot better. And
Mm-hmm.
to really do that, you need to know the languages, you need to know the history in a way that I just don't. I
Sure.
don't, I'm not a scholar of Zen Buddhism uh, or East Asian religions. So for me, writing about the Ensos was a bit of a fun like way to push me outside of my comfort zone. So in the middle of these columns, there's this swirl,
Yeah.
and it's not technically an Enso because an Enso is supposed to be circular, but an Enso it's a convention in Japanese calligraphy of making a circle, and the idea is that it's sort of when you look at it, you can see the quality of someone's personality or meditative focus or their kind of mood. You can see it in the line that they generate. There, you could think of the line of calligraphy as being like a heart meter. What are those called in hospitals? The thing that goes beep beep beep.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Heart monitor.
Yeah. Heart monitor, I suppose. Yeah.
I'm not that kind of doctor, okay? So this I thought maybe he was playing with that idea of the enso by writing the hay as the circular thing. Now you can't really tell it's a hay unless maybe you recognize the verse or he tells you it's supposed to be a hay. This is when captions become important. But Plodwinski, I think it's good to back up a little bit. He's an interesting artist because he has many different levels of training. He was born in America, raised in New York City, made Aliyah to Israel. He first trained in a very traditional way as a Torah scribe. So this was probably in the 80s. He was doing this, learning how to do the kind of how to write a Torah scroll, how to write a mezuzah, the little bits of parchment
Mm-hmm.
that have verses from Deuteronomy that in Jewish practice you affix to your doorway of your house. So doing these sorts of things, and I would hesitate to call this an art. It's more of a ritual craft because it's
Mm-hmm.
very specified how it's done, and then you're not supposed to sign it. It's not really about you. You're doing this as a service to a community. You're kind of like a vessel for the text.
Mm-hmm.
So he did that. Then he went to the UK and he trained in English language calligraphy, and now he's sort of straddling this world of craft of creating manuscripts that are meant for communities to use, as well as art in the sense of something that is self-expression, creatively playful. I really don't want to get too into the art craft distinction, but suffice it to say,
Sure.
it's a really blurred line between the two. So I think with this particular, oh gosh, I forgot what your question was.
Apophasis. The he. Yeah.
Apophasis. I think he was playing with both his own forays into Tai Chi. He is one of a bunch of Western calligraphers. And please, when I say Western, I'm putting that in like 20 scare quotes, okay? Uh, Western calligraphers who have become informed by East Asian traditions. You could go all the way back to someone like Lloyd Reynolds, who really started the calligraphy world in Portland in Oregon, on the kind of this whole Pacific Northwest calligraphy world. And he was at Reed College in the 60s, and there were beat poets who were involved in his circle, and they were reading Zen texts. So this goes way back. He's part of this group and interested in not just letters as something to be done correctly, but something to be done gesturally. And also, there's been a group of Roman alphabet calligraphers, which is probably a better way to say Western, who have been thinking about legibility. If something is illegible or less legible, it makes you stop and look, and it helps you recognize the limits of language in communicating. If you literally can't read what it says, I think there's a correlation there with what in Christian theology one might call apophasis, this idea of not knowing God's attributes positively, but sort of knowing what God is not, or dwelling in the extreme gap between what we can know of God and what God is,
Mm-hmm.
right? That God can be beyond our categories. So I think I think that's what's going on here. It's like the language is powerful and the language is limited because it's communicating so much more than just a statement of God in words. It's communicating a presence of God, an experience of God that we see in his writing.
So yeah, what I'm hearing you also say is the calligraphy, the form of the calligraphy almost compels the viewer to sort of slow down and attend to the difficulty of actually reading it, almost as an intentional act of the author as well, of the artist as well, rather, to sort of compel him to slow down and contemplate that unknowability as well, which is God's unknowability in itself, right? It seems.
Yeah, and you have this in Islamic calligraphy too. Certain like ornate patterns of the basmalah or the
Mm-hmm.
shahada that are basically illegible unless you know what it's supposed to say, or you have those texts, those words so memorized that
Mm-hmm.
you can pick up letters and be like, oh, that's what this is.
Yes. No. Yes. Absolutely. So before we move to the next artwork you look at, I do want to have one more question on Plutwinsky because there was an
Yeah.
interesting section of your article. You write, when making his Zen style Hebrew lettering, Plutwinsky avoids creating quote unquote Japanesey Hebrew letters, which would caricature either language's visual forms. In this way, he's like a comparative theologian who seeks to learn from another tradition, even as he is careful to respect differences between religions. I appreciated that because it's also a question of are you just how do you genuinely learn from another tradition without inadvertently caricaturing it, reducing it, simplifying it, inappropriately appropriating it, for lack of a better term, right, as well, but actually genuinely becoming enlivened by it and transformed by it, as you would imagine the creator of whatever artifact or religious phenomenon you're studying would want you to be, even though you're not necessarily going to convert or become or change, religion as well, but you really want to be changed by it. Could you maybe speak to that sort of balance between Japanese Hebrew letters and learning from it?
I
I
have
like
no
that.
memory of writing that phrase. Gosh, it's fun to listen back to things you wrote and be like, I
I mean,
said
I
that.
liked it because it was an interesting point.
I don't know what he meant by Japanesey. I think now reading that, I'm thinking of this is really bad. Chop suey letters.
Mm-hmm.
So in typography, this is called stereotypography, where you
Stereotypography, interesting, yeah.
a certain like caricature of an ethnic group through letter forms. The really obvious example would be like certain older Chinese American restaurants where they have that lettering style on the sign
Yeah,
that will sort of look like chopsticks, or it's kind
yeah,
of really cheesy.
yeah.
Or you go to
May,
a
may,
certain like Mexican restaurants and they'll have like the taco font,
yeah,
Fiesta, that sort of thing.
yeah,
I
or like the
I
fonts that Disney uses for Aladdin and Mulan or something like that. Yeah.
Oh my God, exactly. Yes, Aladdin, stereotypography, we could all over the world it goes,
Hmm.
unfortunately. So I wonder if that's what he was
Interesting.
thinking
No,
of sort of, yeah, I'm not quite sure what he meant by that, but at the end of the day, and he doesn't know, he doesn't speak Japanese. So to really do Japanese calligraphy, if you're
mhm,
not intimately acquainted with the shapes and the language and what they mean, of course you're not going to do it
mhm.
justice
I mean,
as an
he's
art.
when he describes it. Sorry, what he's doing. He describes it as a comparative theologian in a way, right? He wrote, "The elements I seek to use, quote unquote, from the Zen calligraphic tradition probably exist in my own tradition, Judaism, but are probably less clearly articulated in Jewish sources. I do feel there is an overlap between Zen aims and aims mentioned in certain Hasidic writings, at the very least involving the ego." And that's very much in the exercise of comparative theology. It may not, if you study Hinduism or Buddhism as a Christian, or if you're a Buddhist and you study Islam, or you're Muslim and you study Christianity, a lot of the things you're studying in the other tradition may exist in some form in your own. It's just that it it took your in a way encountering the other religion to sort of remember it and re-encounter it and reimagine it, sort of rediscover it, if you will. And I feel like that's also something he's doing in his own calligraphic fusion, if you will, or comparison.
I think you got to interview him and find
Yeah,
out
no, that's great.
where he goes next.
That's
And
great.
he's not the only Hebrew calligrapher who's done this,
Hmm.
but I think he was one of the maybe ones who's more well known about it.
Hmm. So then let's move on to the second object, art object you study, the Clayton's AIDS icon, right? Ewan Clayton's AIDS
Yes.
icon, created for the Diocese of Durham. It was
Mhm.
functioning as a liturgical piece for World AIDS Day.
Mhm.
So maybe again we'll have the images available, but it'd be great for listeners just briefly for you to describe that triptych, what prayers in it, and so forth.
Okay, so triptych is this is specifically like an altar piece, right? So you have it in the front of a church, and during a liturgical service, you'd have this kind of, it might have icons, might have images of saints or of Christ, and it might also have text.
Hmm.
So this is a triptych that he made. Clayton, I honestly have no idea what label he used for his religion now, but it's fair to say he was deeply formed by Catholicism. This is part of his visual language, his experience.
Hmm.
He was actually the last person to join the community of Ditchling, which is
Mm.
sort of a religious craft art community that no longer exists. Probably its most famous member, if you're interested in theology and art, was a man named Eric Gill, who was, let's just say, quite a character. So he grew up in that community, and he grew up surrounded by this kind of this interconnection between craft and art and the sacred. He also, in his early 20s, I believe, maybe his mid late 20s, he was a Benedictine monk for a few years.
Okay.
So all of that is coming into this. He was asked to create a piece of art that would enable liturgy and enable prayer. And when you open this up, it's this wood object, sort of like three pieces of wood connected by hinges. So when you open it up, there's three parts, hence the name triptych. And in the middle, there's this giant painting of Christ with just black sumi ink, sort of an outline
Hmm.
of this figure on the cross. If you look at it very closely, and the quality, it has the same kind of brush quality as a lot of Japanese calligraphy. When you look at it closely, it's actually composed of letters that say, I think it says, Christ has AIDS.
Hmm.
On the left, there's these two texts, these prayers that I don't know if he wrote them or someone else supplied the text. I think it says in the article that they got them from a South African theologian,
Hmm.
and he writes them in this very gestural way. It's very like you could sort of imagine the forcefulness and the play of his pen. On the left, it says, "Lord, forgive us that we love to stigmatize and discriminate, projecting onto others the hurt and fear of our own hearts."
Hmm.
And the right says, "We thank you that on the cross Jesus took all stigma onto himself, that we might be free. Grant this liberation may be known by all living with AIDS/HIV." I thought what was very powerful about this is he wasn't praying for those people living with this disease to be healed, because that doesn't ask the broader church to re-examine their prejudices quite as sharply.
Mm-hmm.
But if you say, we pray that we stop stigmatizing and discriminating, there's a bit more of a prophetic challenge in there to the church. To not just say, oh, God help those poor people, but God help us for how we've treated them. So some might say this came a little too late. This came in the mid-2000s.
Yeah.
It might have been maybe more powerful 20 years earlier, but I still think it's a powerful work. And can I share a tiny bit of gossip?
Well, yeah.
So this was used for one, I think it was 2004, 2005. It was used for a complete liturgical year, and it went into churches throughout the diocese, and rituals were done around it. I couldn't find out a whole lot more about those rituals, but I have images. There's one where there's a young woman who has these kind of red ribbons tied around her. And so I think there's a lot of imagery here that the services were trying to use to evoke like the sense of shame or the sense of being an outsider that someone living with HIV or AIDS would have been put through by their community. But also, after that year was over, Robert Cooper, who was the deacon at the cathedral, who was also in charge of the diocesan committee that was trying to commission art and for the liturgy, I asked him where this is now, and he said, well, the next bishop came along and didn't care for the theology of this, and it's currently sitting in my attic.
Oh dear.
It's still owned by the diocese, so he can't give it away to an art museum where at least it will be on display, or he couldn't give it to a seminary that might, have it in their collections. But the bishop didn't want anything to do with it. So I talked about this in early 2024 after this article had gone to print quotation marks. I talked about this at the Queer and Trans Studies and Religion Conference at UC Riverside. And there was a guy in the audience, he raised his hand. He said, well, I'm an Anglican priest. And the bishop who had this thing put away was famed New Testament scholar N.T. Wright. So everything comes full circle.
Jeez. N.T. Wright?
Yes, I'm okay dishing that.
yeah, I mean that's fine.
He's been pretty public about his theology on these matters.
Public. Everyone knows, and so and he's doing fine with or without us mentioning him anyway.
Yeah. Yes. So anyway, that's the whole story, and it's a reminder also, for your students, like these objects have lives, right? They don't just exist in the sort of period they're used for. What happens to them after? And it's too bad this isn't in an art museum or something. I was involved with Wesley Theological Seminary, their Luce Center for Religion and the Arts, and the leader at the time of that was very interested in getting this to be part of their collection, but it was sort of like the deacon would have been happy to, but he didn't own it, and so it didn't work out.
Yeah, I mean, the icon is. I mean, it's the AIDS icon is fascinating because it was functioning it seems to be functioning as a liturgical object within churches, at least Anglican churches, and it is conveying a certain theology, a certain contextual or liberation theology, sort of Christ becoming those sort of closest to, drawing near to those who are brokenhearted, who are stigmatized, who are suffering, as well, compelling us to respond accordingly. But would you say it's also functioning as protest as well, or how would you think about that?
Oh, so I think you could draw comparisons to things like, like ACT UP, sort of AIDS activist protests, the art that they created. I think it's more similar to things like, I'm from the San Francisco Bay Area, at Grace Cathedral, the Episcopal Cathedral in San Francisco. There's a whole little kind of side chapel to people who have lived with AIDS, with this altarpiece designed by Keith Haring. I think it's more like that, or I think it's more like the AIDS memorial quilt, where there is a kind of protest in it, but it's the grief and the prayer and the bringing people into a community, the circle of love and community. That is a protest too, but it's a different kind.
Yeah. Yeah, this was a fascinating piece too in your analysis.
I feel like I'm going on all kinds of sidetracks here.
No, this is great. No, let's let's do slowly wrap up here because I'm curious also about if someone were to if you were to use or if a professor wanted to use this article and some of the topics you cover maybe in an undergraduate classroom, whether it's on the Bible as sacred text or art and religion, Jewish-Christian relations even, religion and arts. Is there a certain practice or concrete practice you would invite the students to try, or some other exercise that would help them understand the difference between, even though, so we understand that all text is sort of embodied, there is still a difference between reading the psalm on a piece of paper and seeing the psalm sort of on the Shivati columns. So is there a practice that could help students sort of even further recognize this difference or experience it?
So I'll say three things. One, just copy a page of a sacred text.
Yeah.
See what you experience, see what you notice. It forces you to slow down, although in some ways it forces you to not think about the text at all because you're so busy just thinking about each letter and getting it spelled correctly.
I mean, especially if it's in a language the student doesn't understand, which would be even sort of like a different practice as well. But yeah.
Yes, very much so.
Yeah.
Draw a letter, just one letter, but draw it. Don't write it, draw it, because calligraphy is closer to drawing than handwriting. It's very slow, and you have to sort of think about shape. The third exercise I like to do for looking at calligraphy, turn the page upside down.
Mm-hmm.
That short circuits the part of your brain that's just reading and decoding the meaning of the words. It makes you look at the shapes and how how they kind of play with each other, or the quality of line, which is very important for both of these. I found both of them very powerful, and Pledwitzky told me he wanted to see his columns used as liturgical objects or ritual objects, and the opportunity didn't materialize. But I think these are very ripe for that kind of opportunity, the way that Clayton's was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I teach in arts and literature of Islam and Muslim cultures. We already have often a professional calligrapher come and give us a 2-day workshop, and then students have to do a work of calligraphy as well. And there's lots of other art projects they do. But I think I may incorporate sort of copying a text, as well, for sure, as just the idea, especially nowadays where everything is so digitized and so forth, but slowing down and taking time, that's a great exercise in English or in a foreign language. Yeah.
Digitizing has its benefits because you can now go and look at wonderful major medieval manuscripts.
Oh yeah, the museum,
full color.
Digital museums are like so cool now. They're amazing. Okay, so another question, maybe our last question here to think about. Since you wrote this piece, are there any other calligraphic arts or other objects that you've encountered or want to go visit to write something about or just contemplate since then that struck you?
So I have a problem, and that is I'm a serial project starter. So
Mm-hmm.
I have a lot of things that I've either committed to or said I'm going to do. The one I'm doing this summer, I'm writing a book about the work of Martin Wenham. He's
Wenham?
a banker.
Okay.
Martin Wenham, Wenham. He lives in Wales. He's in his 80s. He carves letters in wood, and he uses this as a way to think about language. I don't think he'd call himself a religious artist, but a lot of the texts he works with are sacred text, mostly from his own background. So I'm writing this book this summer because I'm really captivated by what he does with language and how he uses this art form to dig into text and what it can mean in ways that conceptual study of those texts might not get at. I think, for example, working visually setting a text that way is not dissimilar to maybe a composer setting it to music, like a liturgical composer. There's a lot of thinking about and interpreting what a text's kind of center or meaning or ethos or feeling is that goes into that. So I am always finding more to write about. There's not a lot of people who work on contemporary calligraphy in this way, and that means it's a very open field. I also am planning to write a book about Ben Shahn, because he also did a lot of lettering work. The
You said Ben Shahn?
Lithuanian Ben Shahn, yes, Lithuanian American Jewish artist, worked in many media, but toward the end of his life, he especially got into lettering and Hebrew and English.
Amazing. All right.
Yeah,
All right.
yeah,
Well,
yeah.
yeah, thank you so much for this conversation. Certainly insightful and expanding a little bit on your article, and I think it'll be certainly edifying for students who can read the article, listen to this conversation. Is there anything else you'd like to share before we close up?
No, just thank you for having me.
Great.
Thank you for having me on here, and I'm glad someone's reading my stuff.
Yeah.
Because you write things and they go out in the world, and you think, did anyone read this?
Yeah. No, people are reading it. I'm sure they are. Uh, well, thank you so much, John. It was really a pleasure to speak with you, to see you today, and I hope to remain in touch.